Have you already acquainted yourself with subscriptions, management groups, and so on, but still wonder how best to set them up in order to make the most room for growth? Have you tried learning Microsoft's best practices but find the cloud adaptation framework, enterprise scale, landing zones, and so on so daunting that you've just about given up? Well, in this video, I'll cover the gist of landing zones and how to use Azure Policy to avoid anarchy so you can hit the ground running when time comes for you to design your first Azure environment. Later on, I'll also go over an example of a rather simple design that uses these things, at the same time as it provides a lot of room for growth and governance. The cost is basically $0. Does that sound like a plan? Cool. This video is part 3 of a series, so if you haven't watched the previous 2 parts, then I would suggest you pause this video and go back and watch them. It's not totally necessary, but it might be beneficial to know about the building blocks before you learn how to put them together. Plus, use. Anyway, let's get started by taking a look at landing zones. What are they and why on earth should you put them in Azure? Straight logically, a landing zone sounds like a place where you land things, right? So for an IT solution, that would be the place where you set up things, right? Yes, that's completely right. So just skip to the next section. I'm kidding, of course, but at the same time not. The really basic explanation of landing zones in Azure would be just that. It's a place to put or land stuff. The general idea of a landing zone in Azure is that it should be a place where all the plumbing is in place. In a landing zone, there should already be networking in place, policies, cost management, access to shared services, and so on. But let's take a bit of step back and talk about where the idea of landing zones comes from, the variations of it. So landing zones is a part of Microsoft's cloud adaptation framework, which in turn is a huge set of guidelines and best practices on how you should plan for and design an Azure environment, how to prepare the Azure environment, how to migrate there, how to govern, and so on and so on. And contrary to what you might think, this framework is not something that Microsoft has cooked up all by themselves. The framework is a culmination of insights from Microsoft, their partners, customers, MVPs, and others. It's based on a ton of experience and lessons learned from the field, and it's constantly evolving. So it's a really great framework, but it can also be a lot to take in. And that's why we're focusing on only the landing zones for now. If you've watched my previous videos, you've heard me go on about how you should have multiple subscriptions and a hierarchy of management groups to put them in. But I get that that's not what everyone wants. And the cool thing then is that landing zones can be utilized in both a multi-subscription management group setup and if you only have one subscription. In their documentation of landing zones, Microsoft talks about 2 distinct implementation approaches, the enterprise scale and the start small and expand. They also list some consideration for each of the 2 approaches. You'll find a link to this down in the description, of course. The short explanation of the differences between these 2 is that the start small and expand approach can be deployed within a single subscription, while the enterprise scale approach really can't be deployed unless you have multiple subscriptions. This is, of course, not the whole story, but that's the gist of it. If you're a small org that doesn't have plans to grow in Azure, then the start small and expand approach is probably going to fit you nicely. Just keep in mind that you might end up having to redesign or even redeploy services in Azure should the need for more scalability arise. And circling back to why you should be using landing zones, well, I have a couple of keywords here: scalability, modularity, and simplicity. When you're designing and building Azure environments, define what a landing zone should have in your case. That could be a VNet, for example, and then that VNet should have X, Y, and Z subnets. Those subnets should maybe have user-defined routes that points traffic through your main hub VNet. Maybe they should have some NSGs with a couple of predefined rules. maybe the landing zone should have some basic policies. The list could go on, but once you've nailed that down, you have a landing zone that's modular. You can then deploy any number of these modules, scaling as far as you want. And having that module also makes it easy for you to set up new landing zones because you know what should be there. Maybe you've also have it defined in code, like Bicep, making it even easier to deploy more landing zones. Alright, let's move on to Azure Policy so we can stop this anarchy. Have you ever made a decision on which regions to use in Azure, which VM sizes to use, and so on, only to have that one rogue tech that does his or her own thinking and deploys stuff that's the opposite of what you've decided on? Well, that happens a lot, trust me. And this doesn't have to be with ill intentions either. Maybe they saw that the prices for whatever they were deploying was cheaper in that region or for that other VM size. Or maybe they just fancied the latest version of that VM size. Those kind of decisions could actually end up costing you money. Say if you're already using reservations, which you should, and have reservations for a version 3 of the D series VMs in West Europe. Then somebody deploys either a version 4 of the D series in West Europe, or they deploy in North Europe instead. Then you cannot utilize your reservations for that deployment. Thus, you end up either paying pay-as-you-go prices, which are higher, or purchasing reservations specifically for that deployment, and neither is something you want to do. So use Azure Policy to deny deployments that doesn't fit your design. As an example, on the top level of your design, implement a policy that specifies allowed regions and allowed VM SKUs. That's a way to use Azure Policy to set up governance in regards to compliance with your design, resource consistency, and cost. But Azure Policy can do more. It's also a nice tool to have security-wise. For example, you could have Azure Policy audit whether or not your resources are secured with threat detection capabilities, if storage accounts are accessible over public internet, and so on. There are a ton of great checks for these kinds of things built right into Azure Policy. Lastly, I would also use Azure Policy to enforce and even do tagging for you or your technicians. Because in a large Azure environment with hundreds of resources, it can be a real pain to figure out what things are for, which cost center they belong to, who set it up in the first place, and so on. And Azure Policy can be used to require tagging so that the people actually deploying stuff doesn't skip that part altogether. But it can also make it easier for those people by having resources inherit tags from their parents. There's also more that Azure Policy can do, like configure backup. But if I go into detail on all these things that Azure Policy can do, then this video will be a couple of hours long. So just keep in mind that you should set up Azure Policy to work for you, making your life easier, saving you money, and so much more. And now, for that last thing I promised, that simple design that uses some of the things that we've been talking about in this series. This is a management group structure that I've been showing earlier on in this series as well, but it's a really good scaffolding, I guess, to have for you to build upon. As you can see, we have a management group directly under the tenant root group, which in this case is named Contoso. That would be the name of your company, for example. The reason why we have this management group right under the tenant root group is that, for example, if your company is going to do a merger with another company, then that company can be migrated into its own management group structure at the same level as your company. And further on, we have platform, which is where you'd put all things that are shared services, services that all of your Azure services should utilize. For example, in the identity management groups, we'll put domain controllers, Azure AD domain services, if that's what you're using. And in management, this is where you'd put things like automation accounts that are used for change tracking, inventory management, update management, and so on. I would also put some log analytics here for, well, a central log for where you can do querying, where you can do alerting, and so on and so on. In the connectivity management group, this is where I'd put things like your express routes, your site-to-site VPNs, other VPN solutions, but most importantly, those should be placed in a hub VNet, which would be your central VNet, or VNets if you are a larger scale company. So connectivity would hold all the bits and pieces that are used to connect things across your Azure tenants. And then we have a management group called landing zones, which in this case I have split up into corp and online. You can of course keep adding more and more management groups under the landing zones here. This is just an example, and for corp here, this is where subscriptions that contain resources that need connection to, for example, your on-prem network, while online is for subscriptions with resources that are fine on their own, that's just standalone. They don't have any connections to other services across your Azure tenant. And the two last one here, decommissioned, probably self-explanatory. Any subscriptions that are meant to be decommissioned, deleted, and so on. While sandbox should be your default management group where all new subscriptions are placed. This, for example, would be Visual Studio Enterprise subscriptions, those kind of benefits subscriptions that people get there. And this should have no connections to the rest of your environment, but it's a place for people to play around, I guess. So that's the management group structure. And access-wise, I would assign access to a really few number of people on the top here on the tenant root group. For the Contoso, you probably don't need anyone to have specific access there, but then you could assign access to your identity people on the identity management group, or the networking guys could have access to the connectivity management group and the corp management group, just because that's where most of the networking are done, and so on and so on. So specify the least amount of access on the lowest level possible. If someone needs access to both online and management, don't give them access to Contoso, for example, in order to provide access to those two management groups. Just give them access to those two distinct management groups instead. And this sort of structure is also where you, or where I would assign Azure policies. So I would start out with a really basic policy in this case. For example, on the top here, or maybe on the Contoso management group, I would set up a Azure policy that enforces allowed regions and allowed VM SKUs, like I mentioned earlier. But also do some tag requirements, like, for example, require a tag that defines which kind of environment it is. Is it test? Is it dev? Or staging, or something like that? And where the solution is, I don't know, who's the owner, the responsible party, or something like that. If you set up that kind of policy on Contoso here, you would have that apply to all the underlying management groups. And yeah, like I mentioned, also set up tag inheritance, so that, for example, on the corp management group, you could have a tag inheritance, meaning that if you set some tags on the corp management group or on a single subscription beneath the corp management group, then that tag is inherited to every resource that is placed below that level. And yeah, so much for management groups, access, and Azure policy. Let's take a look at some networking designs. So this is a kind of setup that I've been going on and on about, the hub and spoke setup. And this is a really basic way of defining hub and spoke. It doesn't have to be any more advanced than this, but you have the central hub VNet here in the middle, which I said should be placed in, for example, the connectivity management group. And this should hold your express routes, your VPN connections, and of course an Azure firewall. If you don't fancy having a Azure firewall, you can also use some third-party solutions and use those instead. If you, for example, prefer a FortiGate over the Azure firewall, which is understandable. And on the side here, we have a couple of spokes, and this spoke or this one could be their own solutions, living on their own, but sometimes they need to connect to things like internet or another spoke. And then we have some user-defined routes on this spoke VNet that states that all traffic should pass through the hub VNet and more specifically the Azure firewall or third-party firewall. By doing it that way, you have total control over the network traffic that flows in and out of the spoke, and you don't have to worry about VNet peering between the spokes, for example, because that can be a hassle when it gets to many peerings. So this is a way to minimize the number of VNet peerings and thus lowering the complexity of your networking, making it quite easier to manage and to wrap your head around. So that's landing zones, Azure Policy, and walkthrough of a simple design. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. And yeah, thank you for watching.